From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights Podcast.
Welcome to Distilled DC, a miniseries from Hamilton Place Strategies HPS Insights, focused on how communicators distill complexity. I'm your host, Andrea Christianson, a managing director at HPS. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Rayna Farrell. Rayna is Chief of Staff for Public Affairs at the Business Roundtable, a trade association whose members include the CEOs of major U.S. companies. Rayna has been with the Business Roundtable for more than 6 years, serving in multiple communications roles. Previously, she was a legislative aide for the lobbying firm Melman, Castagnetti, Rosen, and Thomas, and was a staffer for Rep. Cedric Richmond, who is now a senior advisor to President Biden. Rayna, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Andrea. This podcast is such a great idea, so kudos to you and the whole team at HPS. I listened to your conversation with Sarah earlier this week. From HP to a wine club in Italy, it was fascinating. So I'm really happy to join you today, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, we're really happy to have you and hear your point of view and perspective. I mean, not all of us can go start a wine club in Italy, but we can dream, right?
We sure can.
So you've been at the Business Roundtable for more than 6 years now. Do you want to just tell me a little bit about your role there and how it's evolved?
Yeah, so you mentioned it in the intro, Andrea. During those 6 years, my role has certainly changed. I've done a little bit of everything. I'd say in my current job as Chief of Staff, my role is to set the overall strategy for the organization, both internal and external communications. And then in overseeing the day-to-day operations for the public affairs team, I then help put people into positions to execute on the strategy. So in the simplest terms, it's develop the strategy and then manage the team on execution.
Okay. And you've been promoted multiple times. So you mentioned you've had a lot of different roles there. Can you talk about your progression at the BRT and any recommendations that you have for others on how they can think about growing their role within their organization?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for raising that. I do feel really fortunate that the Roundtable has valued my contributions over the years and rewarded that with more and more work. My experience has been interesting in that I've been at the same organization for 6 years, but I've worked for many different leaders. So during my time there, the Roundtable has had 4 different chairmen, starting with Randall Stevenson of AT&T, Doug Oberhelman, Caterpillar, Jamie Dimon with JP Morgan Chase, and now Doug McMillan with Walmart. At the same time, we've also had internal changes. I previously worked under Governor Engler, and then when he retired, we brought on Joshua Bolten. So, and all leaders manage differently, right? Different personalities, different goals, and ways to optimize output. So I've had exposure to many different ideas, and I think I've been adaptable. So it's important to not be so rooted in an approach or a way of doing something that you can't grow and change or adapt. And I think, as you know, change can be challenging and uncomfortable, but it also provides new opportunities, specifically opportunity to take on more work. And I raised my hand for everything. If there was extra work to do, I volunteered for it. So I think that would be my advice if you're looking to grow within an organization. First, be great at the job you're in. Do it well. And then 2, take advantage of new opportunities. So ask yourself, can you take this on from a bandwidth capability set? And if so, then don't be afraid to raise your hand for more work. I think it's the old saying, you have to do the job before you have the job, which has certainly been true in my experience.
That's really great advice, particularly the piece about adaptability and just, you've got to be flexible. A lot of times I say that communicators have to be chameleons. We have to meet people where they are and adapt to their wants and needs. And we can still have points of view and perspective and bring them along on the path that we think is correct as a communications expert. But we also have to build trust with those people. So I think that's a really important point and leads me to my next question, because in terms of adaptability, I mean, the Business Roundtable is involved in a ton of different legislative issues, whether it's tax, whether it's trade, education, everything. And so you have to know a lot about a lot of things on the public affairs side. But I'm curious, looking back across your time, is there something that stands out as the most exciting issue that you've had the opportunity to work on?
Yeah, well, as you said it, Andrea, a lot of legislative issues were engaged in. Really, there's almost no policy issue that the roundtable doesn't touch. So the easy thing would maybe be to say Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, which Andrea, we worked so closely on, which feels like so many years ago, or the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because those were so consuming and they were massive campaigns and ultimately, favorable outcomes for both. But what I've been most excited about and what I wanted to talk about with you is the updated statement on the purpose of a corporation, which if people are listening that aren't familiar with that, it was an updated statement. The Business Roundtable and our CEOs said that the role of a corporation society is to serve all of their stakeholders, which includes employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. I think since then, it's really taken on this idea of stakeholder capitalism. But that was a really exciting issue because during the process, it became clear to me that we were creating a legacy of sorts of what business can be and should be in society. So we did that in August of 2019, and you follow that announcement with 2020, which was, arguably one of the most challenging years in history with multiple crises, health, economic, race. And as awful as it was also in some ways gratifying to have a year where those principles were put into practice in a very real way. So from the pandemic to, CEOs and prioritizing the health and safety of their employees and customers, to then the nation's reckoning with race and all the ways they stepped forward to advance racial equity and justice. And we were able to say, this is what we meant by that statement. And that was really, an exciting topic to work on.
Yeah, I mean, lots of opportunities to follow through on it in 2020. That is for sure. Would you say that 2020 and kind of the position of CEOs and businesses and stakeholder capitalism in the statement, would you say that's been maybe the biggest challenge you've faced at BRT, or would you identify another one?
No, so I think that's absolutely right, Andrea. It was the most exciting project, but it was also my most challenging. And a core part of that challenge was just the pushback we received on purpose of a corporation from the left and from the right. I mean, we received some praise when we made the announcement, but also a great deal of criticism. And as a communicator, that was frustrating because it felt like what we were saying and what we were doing didn't seem that radical to us. In many ways, it's how the CEOs had been already running their companies for a really long time. And the pushback and the mischaracterization and how the statement in some ways was just really misunderstood was challenging. But I think, in dealing with that, we dealt with it probably in a way that applies to all communicators that deal with difficult issues. And we confronted it by doing the work. So demonstrating every day that we meant what we said. And we knew actions, speak louder than words. And it's been a real exercise in doing exactly what we committed to doing and making sure that the key audiences are aware of all of that good work. So when JP Morgan's making investments in Detroit, that we're making the connection between that action and how that applies to purpose of a corporation. So it's been an educational effort as well, but there has been opportunity with, unfortunately, the challenges we've recently faced.
Yeah, and I'm curious about how you guys are thinking ahead on that. I mean, looking at 2021, there's a lot of expectations for a strong economic rebound. President Biden said last night that we should all be able to get together on July 4th. And there's a lot of hope going into 2021 and beyond. And so just kind of thinking about how is the Business Roundtable and your members thinking about continuing this commitment to stakeholder capitalism kind of in a new post-COVID era?
Yeah, well, not being out of the woods yet on COVID, I think we see the stakeholder capitalism playing out and everything we're doing right now in the vaccination effort, right? So Business Roundtable recently launched a campaign, Move the Needle, which is, in the most literal sense, what companies are doing to move the needle. And that's everything from developing the vaccine to distributing the vaccine to now administering the vaccine. And we have members who do all three. And then figuratively moving the needle, making process to help end the pandemic, and whether that's continuing to provide masks to employees or just continuing to educate and talk about safety measures. So I think, again, that's a good example too, as we're starting to transition and see the light at the end of the tunnel, that the stakeholder capitalism and this purpose of a corporation continues to play out and be front and center for our members. Additionally, talking about the economy specifically, and as we start to rebuild and invest, our CEOs have been really focused on small businesses who have been hit the hardest from the pandemic. So looking at policies moving forward, they're going to help them get back on their feet and help hire workers and open their doors and welcome customers back in. So they're really all in on helping small businesses as well.
Awesome. That's great. All right. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, Rayna will share her advice for other communicators.
HPS affiliate Flag Media Analytics is a next-generation media monitoring firm designed to shorten the decision-making process for public affairs professionals. Our expert analysts will work with your team to ensure only the most relevant content reaches their inbox and provide custom metrics solutions for the evolving news cycle. To learn more about how Flag can get you ahead of the cycle, visit flagmediaanalytics.com.
We're back on Distilled DC, a mini-series from HPS Insights on communicating complexity. I'm here with Rayna Farrell, and we're about to get her advice to new and seasoned communicators looking to excel in their careers. Rayna, working at a trade association, you have internal audiences in your membership, as well as external audience, media, legislators, other stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance these two audiences as a part of your role in strategic planning?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Andrea, and I think something every communicator can relate to. At BRT, our CEOs drive the agenda. So you have 208 of America's leading CEOs with very diverse agendas. They represent different sectors whose business needs, employee needs, customer needs, they're all different. And the issues that BRT weighs in on and the policy positions that we take are where those more than 200 CEOs find consensus. And if they're finding consensus, then it's probably good policy, not just for business, but for Americans more generally, their workforce, customers, communities, everyone that has a stake in the company. So when BRT speaks externally, we're speaking with a united voice. And that makes communicating to our external audiences easier, because whether it's media or the White House, I can be confident that our positions are good for many stakeholders. So internally, we find consensus and alignment on issues, and then externally communicate that with consistent messaging. I think consistency is definitely key in both instances and across all audiences.
Yeah, I can imagine getting internal consensus with 200 members can be a challenge from time to time.
Yeah, just a little bit.
All right, so I want to think about listeners who are earlier in their career, just getting started. And one question I wanted to ask you is, what is one thing you wish you had known when you started your career that you think others should know?
Well, I appreciate the question, Andrea, but I feel like I'm still trying to figure it out. So to take the advice with a grain of salt, but I'd say try to find your voice early on and don't be afraid or ashamed to use it. So ask the questions, challenge convention, know that your perspective is unique, and that's a strength for any organization. It took me a long time to realize that growing up in rural Pennsylvania, where I had 19 classmates, wasn't a weakness. It was just a different experience. They gave me a different point of view. So I'd say to find your voice. And the last part of that, and my husband has heard me say this before and kind of rolls his eyes and laughs in the background, but know that it's okay to disagree, but don't be disagreeable.
I think that's great advice. And, I think it is really important to find your voice and to know you don't have to say everything all the time. You don't always have to be the smartest person in the room. But when I first started at HPS and I was going into my very first pitch ever, I'd never done a pitch before. And one of the partners after the pitch was like, I'm really glad you said something in there, because if you don't say something, they don't really know if you've got anything to say. And I was like, thanks for telling me after the pitch. But it's true. I mean, just find your voice and say something that you can feel confident in and feel like you can add value and insight, but you don't have to speak a lot. You just have to, say one or two things. And I think that can help find your voice by understanding those guardrails, that you don't have to be, the most loquacious person in the room.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because Andrea, I mean, as a communicator, we know that these are complex issues. And we're often brainstorming as a group, and know that your voice and your perspective is different. And that should be raised, as we're trying to think how messaging will resonate with different audiences. And if you have a different point of view, I think that should be shared. But you're exactly right. Like, know when it's appropriate to really listen and digest and internalize, and then when it makes sense to really speak up, because you have something, that's people need to hear.
Yes. And a lot of these things that I think we've learned have come from mentors of different stripes at different stages of our career. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the mentors you've had in your career, whether they've been kind of naturally occurring or you've sought them out, and how you think others should think about mentorship.
Yeah. So I have been very fortunate to have great mentors. I've said, I think my career has been a mix of hard work and luck. And I think the luck is that I've come across people in my career who have really wanted me to succeed. So it's the Michelle Obama line, right? You walk through an open door, you hold it open for the person behind you. And I feel like I've experienced that, and will, in my lifetime, always pay it forward. Building the relationships is really important. And if I could give, a recommendation, I would say have as many conversations as you can. Send the email, reach out, go to coffee. One thing that a former boss said to me once, I was seeing that he was getting all these requests from interns and others to meet and have coffee. And I said, how do you do your job when you're, mentoring all these people? He said, you never know. Never say no to an intern or someone, because it's a funny world, and one day you could be working for them. And that always stuck with me. Don't assume because you might be less senior that making a request is putting them out or inconvenient, because I think it's mutually beneficial to grow and build networks. I think it's the saying, your skill set is as deep as your network. So be confident, reach out to people you want to get to know and learn from.
That is really good advice. Thank you for sharing that. So shifting gears a little bit, wanted to ask a little bit about what you view as your must reads of the day. And they can be political, but can also be, I don't know, something fun.
Well, I wake up every morning to a long list of Google alerts that come in on BRT or flag alerts. And so I really start there, but then I start every morning with Axios. I love Mike Allen's AM newsletter, Playbook, and Punch Bowl. I really like what Jake and Anna are doing over there. So that's where I kick off every morning.
Yes, it can be hard to be committed, but I do feel like there's a couple where I'm like, okay, I probably read this one 70% of the time, and that's really good.
Absolutely. And I do like too, with Playbook and Punch Bowl, both, that they have the podcast version as well, which just, it's a new mom working from home, balancing a lot. It's nice to be able to listen to the updates too.
Well, yes. And speaking of you being a new mom, with your baby boy about to turn 1, I'd be curious your experience, being a COVID mom and being back in the workforce. I mean, I think one thing that's really stood out in the pandemic is this surge of women leaving the workforce because they have to care for their children. And so I'd just be curious what your experience has been. How has being a mom changed your perspective on life? And what do you think is most important for companies and employers to think about in supporting new moms?
So it's a great question. Great question, Andrea. And I think you have done an excellent job interviewing me for this podcast, but you are also a new mom with a beautiful baby girl. So and a seasoned communicator. So I am interested in your perspective on that first.
I mean, daycare has been helpful. I certainly feel for parents who haven't had any access to daycare, or our kids are school aged and they've been homeschooling their kids while trying to work. And so I certainly feel that. But I'd say that one thing when I came back from maternity leave was I realized that I could actually produce the same level of work in a more efficient time frame. And it was because I had these forcing mechanisms on my time that I never had before. And so I was pretty surprised at that. But then also just it really does help you realize what's important. Because my daughter was diagnosed with hip dysplasia. And so we've had to go through this whole casting process, and it's just a lot. And I've just been so grateful for the support of my colleagues and my work and obviously family and friends in what's been a really weird time. But asking for help and I think talking about the realities of being a parent have all been really good. And I think the pandemic has maybe even created an opportunity to talk about parenting and work and the balance in a new way that hopefully is positive in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'm hopeful too. I think building on what you said, being a new mom in this environment has made me really appreciate the value of time, professionally and time with family. And I've been trying to work smarter, not harder, with varying degrees of success. One thing I saw on Twitter the other day that just made me laugh, you might remember, but 4 years ago, there was, I think, a BBC interview where the gentleman was doing the interview from home. And in the background, the kids rush in and the wife rush in. She's trying to pull the kids back while he's on live TV. And I'm like, 4 years later, that is all of us. We are all that person now with the background and family, dogs and everything. So I think with that in mind, Andrea, people just being more mindful of the flexibility that's needed when you're juggling and balancing a lot. I think that we're headed in the right direction there.
Yeah. And I think it almost gives more humanity to people too, especially when we're on Zoom all the time and we don't have those, physical interactions with people. I think it's helpful to, be reminded that, we're all dealing with our own challenges. Some are huge blessings most of the time, but others aren't. So.
Yeah, I agree. We all deserve a little bit of grace during this challenging season.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rayna, and to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Distilled DC, a mini-series from HPS Insights. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies' work and our podcast at hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insights. I'm your host, Andrea Christianson. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.